Hello, my name is Lawson, and this is my presentation on artwork I did about military bases abroad and their global impacts for Summer Scholars 2021. I am a third-year student in the Honors College studying sociology and art with minors in environmental humanities, history, and politics and social justice. The U.S. has the most well-funded and powerful military in human history, and I was really interested in exploring this topic because as Americans, we often take for granted our impact on the rest of the world. I came from a background of knowing very little about the US military and began researching fairly broadly. First reading about the history of US international relations. I then studied some of the work of Dr. David Vine, who has documented the most comprehensive list of military bases abroad, and I narrowed my focus. Today I'm going to discuss the 4 projects that I created to communicate the consequences U.S. military bases have on primarily poor communities of color around the world, with limited agency over their circumstances. My first piece focuses on the people of Diego Garcia as one example of the displacement of indigenous people that has occurred to provide the U.S. military with ideal locations for bases. Diego Garcia is an island in the Indian Ocean under the control of the United Kingdom. In the 1780s, enslaved Africans were taken to the island to work on coconut plantations. Then in 1966, the island was leased to the U.S., and 2 years later, the local population of Diego Garcia was forcibly removed with no resettlement assistance. Over the last 5 decades, the Chagosian people have pursued numerous legal battles against the British government in order to try to return to their home. The U.S. Navy remains based on the island, and I painted 3 scenes in watercolor to highlight the experiences of the Chagosian people. The first image is of an American Navy vessel occupying Diego Garcia. The second portrays Chagosian people living with limited resources on Seychelles after being exiled, and the third portrays the Chagos Island Community Association protesting in the UK. The next piece I'm sharing today is an audio-based piece which I would not recommend for earbud users. It is called "It Depends What You Mean by Destroy." The United States military is responsible for the pollution found at the majority of Superfund sites in the United States. With far less regulation and enforcement abroad, pollution and environmental destruction at overseas military locations is likely primarily unaccounted for. Panama was used as a testing ground, resulting in over 100,000 unexploded munitions left near communities, in addition to extremely deadly unaccounted for VX nerve agent. In South Korea, toxic chemicals were leaked down into the harbor. Nuclear oil tanks and pipelines were left unattended, and bases were left behind with dangerous levels of carcinogens such as TPH compounds and BTAs. Next, I'll be addressing the relationship between economic exploitation and military intervention in Central America, specifically focusing on Honduras as an example. In the early 20th century, American influence came to dominate Honduras. Banana plantations owned by foreign businessmen became prominent and encouraged plentiful exports, leaving little for the laborers and citizens of Honduras. By 1913, 3 fruit companies accounted for the majority of exports from the country, which are now 2 companies known as Chiquita and Dole. The formation of so-called banana republics in Central American countries caused bananas to go from a rare fruit to an inexpensive and commonly consumed food in the United States. Throughout the 20th century, the U.S. military had intervened or occupied Honduras 8 times between 1903 and 1925. In 1954, Honduras was the site of military trainings of Guatemalan rebel army facilitated and backed by the U.S. in order to overthrow the democratically elected government of Guatemala. In the 1980s, U.S. presence in Honduras was once again robust, as civil wars occurred throughout Central America. the country was nicknamed the USS Honduras. Honduras remains one of the poorest countries in the West and sustains the claim of the highest murder rate in the world. The School of the Americas is also significant in understanding the U.S.'s impact on the destabilization of Central and South American countries. The painting I created replaces the U.S. forces' guns with bananas to indicate the foolish negligence of the U.S.'s actions throughout the region in the 20th century and today, as well as utilize bananas as a commodity that can represent the relationship between consumer and producer, North and South, and exploiter and exploited. The last piece I created is a collage intersecting issues around dehumanization, exploitation, agency, sex work, East Asian women, and immigration, with the connecting factor of the U.S. military. Two locations most notable within this conversation are Japan and South Korea. On the left you can see the full piece, and on the right will be detailed shots. Okinawa Island is south of mainland Japan. While the U.S. occupied the island after World War II until 1972, prostitution was legal. In 1969, roughly 2% of Okinawan women and girls were involved in prostitution near U.S. military bases. One consequence of such relationships between U.S. troops and Okinawan women is that approximately 4,000 children have been born and abandoned. In South Korea, like in Japan, prostitution catering to the U.S. military began after World War II. After the Korean War in the 1950s, the U.S. military presence in Korea continued to grow, causing sex work to increase as well. After a U.S. act in 1952 allowing Asian brides to evade strict anti-Asian immigration laws in the U.S., women who lived and worked around military bases in Japan, Korea, and other Asian countries have increasingly become military brides. In the late 20th century, as Korea's economy developed, there were labor shortages of Korean women willing to work in camptowns and cater to U.S. forces. In order to continue to profit from the lucrative market, the South Korean government created the E-6 visa. From then on, roughly 90% of those working in bars and establishments around U.S. bases were now from the Philippines or Russia. The E-6, or entertainer visa, has widely been declared as a human trafficking issue. Many of the women that enter Korea with E-6 visas have their passports and visa cards taken away from them upon their arrival at clubs until their contract expires. The women are often called juicy girls as a reference to how the payment system works at the bars. While most of the women are not forced to perform sex work, they are often financially coerced by being barely paid and prevented from leaving. Within the system, women in camptowns often form relationships with military members. While many of the relationships end with the women being left behind when U.S. troops leave, nearly 100,000 women are estimated to have immigrated to the U.S. as GI brides. However, research indicates that 80% of GI Asian American marriages end in divorce. After divorce, the women often have little financial resources, people they know in the U.S., or language skills. Geographically, illegal massage enterprises are often located near an American military base in the U.S. Such patterns and additional data has been linked to prostitution at American massage parlors, noting that many of the Korean women working at such sites were previously married to GIs. Whether in the U.S. or abroad, the relationship between sex workers and American military bases encourages the exploitation of women, catering to large groups of isolated men with militarized masculinities. Notably, military prostitution can also reinforce societal beliefs about supposed racial and ethnic superiority, which perpetuates military members' ability to dehumanize foreign peoples. The 4 pieces I worked on explored a variety of regions around the globe and mediums to communicate the stories and information. I learned so much new information this summer, and I hope you learned something today from this video. Thank you to the Summer Scholars Program for this opportunity and to Professor Aaron Terry for supporting me as my advisor.